Shalom, friends. It's good to see you. Hope you're having a good week. This week, the Torah portion that we're going to be wrestling with is in the book of Exodus, and it's called Mishpatim, which means the judgments, or sometimes translated as ordinances. It reflects the portion of Exodus 21 to 24, verse 18. The context is we've just had the Lord reveal himself at Mount Sinai, and we've had the Ten Commandments. And the next series of words spoken by the Lord, or in sentences, because that's actually what the word Mishpatim actually means. It's a word that means multiple things, both to judge, because it comes from the verb lishfot, which is to judge. And a mishpat in Hebrew is both a sentence and a judgment. And so Hebrew is one of those ancient languages that is poorer in terms of the number of words that it has available to say things. And we've mentioned this before, I think. And so in Hebrew, you have a word that has multiple meanings. And even in English, though, a sentence does actually carry an essence of judgment in it. For example, if I have a sentence that says, "This glass of water is cold," it's a sentence. But I've also made a value judgment. I have felt the glass, I've tasted the water, and I've said it is cold. I've judged it. And so the text will say, "These are the sentences," or "These are the judgments," or sometimes translated, "These are the ordinances." And in this Torah portion, there are 53 mitzvot, 53 do's and don'ts. Almost 10% of the 613 laws of the Torah are actually in this text. And if you've just come down from the mountain, or actually Moses is probably still up on the mountain when these are being spoken to him and recorded, and he's been given the 10 Commandments, then what sort of commands would you expect to immediately flow or to follow from the Big Ten? Right? The 10 Commandments are almost like the foundation of human civilization. And that essentially really is what the Torah is. Too often we live in a world where our teachers and our shepherds have sort of looked at the Torah or the law, as it's mistranslated, and sort of rejected it as sort of like an old school, an Old Testament thing, law bad, grace good. When actually really what the Torah is it's the words of the Lord. It's God's instruction, and by definition that means it has to be good. But a good law doesn't make humans good. A good law doesn't make bad humans, good people. It's still a good law. For example, you have a law going down the road, you can drive at 60. But just because you have a law that says you should drive at 60, and it's a good law, the engineers have said this road, the safest speed for you is 60, doesn't mean that people are automatically going to obey it or that they become good drivers. But the law still is good. And the same with the Torah. It is a fantastic frame and a firm foundation for human flourishing on every level. And so following the Big Ten Commandments, then God begins to express and share the Torah for the Jewish people, for Israel, who are gathered at Mount Sinai, which incidentally are both Jews and Gentiles. I've always discussed before. Jews and Gentiles hear this Torah. So let's read the first 6 verses of Exodus 21 and see what are some of the first laws that God is concerned to give to his people. Exodus 21 verse 1. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. If he comes in single, he'll go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be a slave forever. So, what's interesting about this text? Well, it raises actually lots of questions. So, for the Jewish sages in the Hebraic mind, they ask, why is the command for slavery the very first commands that God would give after having given the 10 Commandments? Surely there might be a more appropriate law to follow, or one that might be a little better. But instead, the first thing that God starts to talk to his people concerns the issue of servants, or indentured servants, or slaves. It's the same word in Hebrew. The word is eved. And eved can mean servant, and it can also mean slave. And in antiquity, those were often actually the same thing. Now, we don't like slavery in our modern day, and neither should we. But the sages or the rabbis would ask, why does God simply not say, thou shalt not have slaves? He's good already by the 10 Commandments. We know he can say things like, thou shalt not. So in our logic, it would follow, thou shalt not have slaves, O slave nation. Because let's remember, the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And after setting people free in the act of the Exodus, in the act of redemption at Passover, bringing them to Mount Sinai, introducing himself and revealing himself to his people, logically shouldn't it follow to say, I've set you free, now you should also set people free. You shouldn't have slaves. Instead, what we get is we actually do have rules about freeing slaves, but after a certain time. And in this case, when you actually acquire one through the act of actually purchasing a person. Now, why would you do such a thing? I hear you ask. Well, in antiquity and in the Hebrew Bible, we discover that there is no such thing as a jail. This law, the idea of indentured servants or slaves, was part of the judiciary system. So if someone was caught with an offense, there are no jails in Hebrew, so you don't lock someone up in a small room and close the door and then keep them there for years on end. That's something you don't find in the Bible. Punishment is not drawn out. Punishment is enacted immediately. For example, if you are having to give the death penalty, and there will be rules concerning that when it's appropriate to do so, then the death penalty is enacted immediately. And it's enacted by the people who actually have the most grievance and or offense. It's not done by an executioner. That occurred in our civilization later. But the idea of an indentured servant or a slave is part of the society's judiciary system. That is, if I steal your car and I get caught, then I have an obligation to A, give your car back, and actually pay 20% more for the offense. That's the punishment. But what happens if I can't give your car back? Maybe I sold it. Maybe I crashed it. Then all of a sudden, you're at a loss financially, and I have no way to actually fulfill the commandment to pay you back. And so what happens is I have to sell myself to you as your indentured servant or slave. But that the idea that a human should be owned by another human is one of those things where God says, it shouldn't be this way, so I need you to set them free. after 6 years. That should be the real state of humans. We should be living in freedom. However, I also know that you have this debt that you have to pay, and so you will work for your master. And the word master in Hebrew is a word we probably don't like saying out loud. It's Baal. We often associate the word Baal with these bad gods in the books of Judges and Kings and things like that, Canaanite deities. And there was a Canaanite deity called the Baal. But the word Baal in Hebrew comes from the verb liv'ol, which means to own. And so a Baal is actually an owner or a master. So someone who's a master of things, also owns property and has rights to things. Also, interestingly, the word husband in Hebrew is also a Baal. And so sorry ladies, when ladies in Hebrew they say, Hu Baal shali, he is my husband, they're literally saying he is my owner. Not that men and women own each other. There is a mutual sharing going on. But here, and God himself is also called a Baal. Actually, he actually says, I am your Lord, Adon, and I am also your master, I'm your Baal. And it's eventually you get into and so the word Baal wasn't a bad word for a while. Even David named a number of his cities that he captured and conquered, and when he renamed them, he would call them Baal Hebron, the master of Hebron, because I've conquered Hebron. But in society, you had this idea of an indentured servant. Someone was working to pay off a debt as part of his crime. But eventually, there would be freedom. And Moses is going to explore that a little further when we get into the idea of the Shemitah, or the year of release for the earth, that the earth itself would also have some time to be free. Or the Jubilee, where every 50 years you would set everybody free and all debts would be repaid. This sort of idea was following a pattern, and the pattern was 7, right? You would work 6, and then in the 7th year you would go free. Where do you get that pattern from? You get it all the way in the beginning at creation, right? Creation sets up the pattern and rhythm of the universe, that cycle of 7s. Work 6 days, rest 1 day. Have a slave for 6 years as he's working your debt off, set him go free, even if he hasn't finished paying his debt off. And so this is the first of the commands that God gives to his people. Now for the sages, they look at the commands and they think, okay, well, there is also the opportunity for a slave to actually have a good relationship with his master, and that would hopefully be the right attitude for each other. They're all caring for each other and enable mutual flourishing. Perhaps the slave says, I've actually got it good here. I was living on the streets before. I'm not a very good businessman. I don't know how to run my own businesses, so I keep getting into debt and sold myself into slavery. But I've got a good master, and I really like the job that I've got. He's provided me with a wife, and I've got children, and I'm flourishing. I actually would like to stay. This is a great life for me and for my family. So you have this opportunity to make the relationship permanent. And again, that's also a pattern of the way that we actually have a relationship with our Heavenly Father. Paul calls himself in the epistles, I am a slave or a servant, a doulos in Greek, okay, a slave to Christ. And that was probably the right attitude. For Jewish sages, they look down at the idea of master-slave relationship and they go, what would be the best example of a good slave-master relationship in the Bible? Well, at the time of the Exodus, they've got one book that they can actually go to, and that's Genesis. Looking into Genesis, they do see a relationship where master and servant had a great relationship. And it's Abraham and his servant Eliezer of Damascus. In the Bible, he's always called Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, or the slave of Abraham. all the time. He never, not once does he get a different epithet. It's Eliezer, Eved Avraham, Eliezer, the servant of Abraham. And their relationship was so special and so intimate that when Abraham, before having children, had actually decided to actually bequeath his inheritance, everything that he owned, which was quite a lot. He was a successful farmer himself and herdsman, that he would pass everything on to his servant, slave, Eliezer. And Eliezer respected and loved his master. Then Abraham had kids. So Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, was going to lose his inheritance. Now, how would that make you feel? This sort of sets up, the sort of spy thriller movie. Eliezer quietly might want to assassinate Ishmael and Isaac and get rid of the competition. But he doesn't do that. He has such a great relationship with his master, and he also now loves the children that have come into his master's household. Even though he has now lost all of his inheritance, he doesn't complain. When Abraham says to Eliezer, please will you go find a wife for Isaac, Eliezer does it. He goes on a long journey, a dangerous journey, and he asks and prays to God, show me the right person. He doesn't try and bring someone back that's inappropriate. He doesn't try and do something that would undermine Isaac. Instead, actually, his service is incredibly faithful. And so what the Torah is teaching us is, in terms of a great frame for our society, we need to remind ourselves of the incredible relationships, the intimate relationships we should have with people that we work with, work for, work underneath us, and also our relationship with the living God. We are his servants. We are his slaves. And we need to have that intimate relationship because he has gone out to provide everything for us. And so much so that after our time of service, okay, we should say, I don't want to leave. I want to stay here forever. And so it's interesting that it says, if the slave, this is in verse 5, if the slave plainly says, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then the master will bring him first to God. Right? God's involved in this transaction. And for ourselves in the New Testament, after we have served the risen Lord, then what does Jesus say in the Gospels? You have but done your duty, O good and faithful servant. Right? So we need to humble ourselves and understand that we have a master, we have a king, and even though that relationship with our master and our king is intimate, and it is personal, and it is close, and he is the best of masters to have, a master that seeks to provide for every aspect of our life, giving us patterns of prayer, patterns of work, patterns of how you should relate to each other and to the earth and to the ground, which is essentially everything that the Torah is trying to teach us. Then that relationship becomes permanent. It becomes something that we ourselves suddenly desire. We ourselves say, I don't want any other king. And God, for his part, doesn't want any other people. He wants us, right? He is the one that saved and redeemed us. He saved and redeemed Israel from Egypt, and he brought them to himself. And he said, I'm going to be your king, and you will be a kingdom of priests. You will be a holy nation. Now, within that holy nation, things will go wrong. But when they do, here is the pattern, here is the way that you can bring about human flourishing. If you happen to owe somebody money, we'll work out how those debts are paid. But then you'll go free. And you can try again, start again. With 6 years of experience that hopefully you won't make the same mistakes again. But perhaps brothers and sisters get on so well that they don't want to leave. And that's actually a really good thing. In the Psalms, Psalm 133, it says, "How good and how pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. There the Lord commands a blessing." And you see it again here, is what would seem so strange of a servant and a slave, and a relationship that you would think is always going to be antagonistic and spiteful and always trying to undermine one or the other, instead can actually be one of love and mutual respect, so much so that the two parties want to make it permanent. So brothers and sisters, it's an interesting thing for us to read straight off after the Ten Commandments. It's not an evil law. Even Paul, when he is confronted with a runaway slave, simply says, "Go back, fill out your obligations, and let me write a letter to your master, and let's try and get that relationship back on track." So again, brothers, the basis of this is, again, love. Every aspect of the Torah since the beginning has been about love and human flourishing, and it is incredibly good wisdom from heaven. Let's join each other again next week as we continue with the Torah.